I want you to try something for a second. Might sound a little basic, but bear with me. Imagine you're sitting in a comfortable chair. Maybe there's some rain against the window, and you're reading a paperback novel. It feels effortless, doesn't it?
It really does.
You just scan the black marks on the page, and almost instantly, a movie starts playing in your head. You see the scenery, you feel the tension, you understand exactly why the hero is terrified of that creaky door.
It feels seamless. It feels like a single, smooth stream of consciousness. You don't feel the machinery working underneath it all.
Exactly. But here's the hook for today's deep dive. That feeling of simplicity. It is a total illusion. Under the hood, your brain is actually conducting this this chaotic high-speed symphony.
The symphony, that's a good way to put it.
And it involves networks that, on the surface, have absolutely nothing to do with language in the way we usually think about it.
It's a massive coordination effort. I mean, we aren't just processing words. We are simulating reality. And the energy cost of that it's surprisingly high.
Today, we're digging into a fascinating piece of research that maps out this hidden symphony. We're looking at a chapter called Neuroimaging Contributions to the Understanding of Discourse Processes by Robert A. Mason and Marcel Adam Just.
This comes from the Handbook of Psycholinguistics. And what makes this work so pivotal is that it tries to move us beyond that old, high school biology map of the brain.
Oh, yeah.
The classic idea that language is just Broca's area and Wernicke's area on the left side, and that's it.
Right, language centers. We tend to think of them as these little isolated factories that just churn out grammar and vocabulary. But this source argues that to understand a story, what they call discourse, we need to look at something much more complex. They call it parallel networks.
Precisely. We're going to explore how the brain doesn't just read text. It monitors coherence, it visualizes space, and this is the part that really changes how you view reading. It literally simulates the minds of other people.
So our mission today is to unpack these networks. We want to understand how the brain processes a story, because that mechanic, it actually explains why we can understand metaphors, why we can predict a character's bad behavior, and what happens when those systems just get overwhelmed.
Yeah, but before we get to the networks, we have to talk about how we even know this stuff.
Right.
Because for a long time, we were looking at the brain with the equivalent of like a blurry magnifying glass.
You're talking about the reliance on lesion studies.
Yeah, exactly. The source highlights this massive shift in neuroscience from studying damaged brains to studying healthy ones.
So what did we learn from those older studies?
It's important to understand the history here. For over a century, since the late 1800s, almost everything we knew about language came from pathology.
Right, from brain damage.
If a patient had a stroke in a specific spot and couldn't speak, we assumed that spot controlled speech. It's logical, but it has a massive blind spot when it comes to storytelling.
Because there's no such thing as a story stroke.
Right. Exactly. The source points out there's no clear case of a patient with just a discourse deficit. You don't find people who can speak perfect sentences, have perfect grammar, but just can't follow the plot of a movie or a book.
So what did they find?
Well, patients with right hemisphere damage had trouble with things like getting jokes or connecting distant ideas, but they didn't have those focal lesions like the patients who lost the ability to speak entirely.
So relying on damage maps didn't tell us how the healthy brain weaves a narrative.
Not really. It just told us where the basic grammar broke down. We needed to see the engine running while the car was driving,
Okay, so that brings us to PET scans.
Right. In the 80s and 90s, which were better, but still way too slow. They required blocked designs. You'd have to have a person read a whole paragraph just to get one grainy image. But reading happens in milliseconds.
Which brings us to the tool that powers this entire paper, fMRI.
Functional magnetic resonance imaging. And specifically, event-related fMRI. This was the game changer.
Why? What did that let them do?
It allowed scientists to measure brain activity sentence by sentence. They could even measure the activity in the tiny gap of silence between sentences.
That gap is crucial, isn't it?
Yeah.
I always assumed the brain rested between sentences, like taking a breath, but the data suggests otherwise.
Oh, quite the opposite. That silence is where the heavy lifting happens. That's where the brain is frantically trying to glue the previous sentence to the current one. Yeah. We move from asking where language happens to when and how.
And that's what led Mason and Justra to this idea of parallel networks.
Yep. They propose that there isn't one language center. There are at least 5 parallel networks running at once.
Okay, let's break these down. The source identifies 5, and I want to walk through these not just as a list, but as like a process. Let's say I'm reading a thriller. I read a sentence. What is the first thing that fires?
So the first line of defense, or maybe the foundation, is the text integration network. This is located in the left inferior frontal and anterior temporal lobes.
This sounds like the traditional language guy we learned about in school.
It is, largely. Think of it as the construction crew. It handles the basic nuts and bolts. It takes the visual input of the words, accesses their definitions, and merges them into a sentence structure.
It's just building the sentence.
It's always running, laying the foundation of the text. Without this, you just have a salad of random words.
Okay, so the construction crew builds the sentence. The man walked into the room. Simple enough. But a story isn't just one sentence standing alone.
Right, and that's where network number 2 comes in, the coherence monitoring network. This operates largely in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex.
Now, dorsolateral prefrontal is a mouthful. In lay terms, this is executive function, right?
Yeah.
Kind of like the CEO of the brain.
In this context, think of it more as the project manager, or maybe the editor. Its job is to constantly ask, does this make sense in context?
The quality control.
Exactly. It checks for consistency. If the story suddenly contradicts itself, say the character was in London in one sentence and in Tokyo in the next without explanation, this area lights up like a Christmas tree.
It's flagging an error.
It is. It demands more processing resources. It effectively says, hey, wait a minute, these two sentences don't fit together. Stop. We need to work harder here to resolve this.
So if I'm reading a mystery novel and the clues don't add up, my dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is going haywire, trying to force them to fit.
Ideally, yes. It's monitoring the consistency of the narrative timeline. If the text flows perfectly, this area stays relatively quiet. It only gets loud when the coherence breaks down.
All right, so we have construction and we have monitoring. But stories aren't just abstract logic puzzles. We see them. That brings us to network number 3, the spatial imagery network.
Located in the intraparietal sulcus. This is fascinating because it activates when the text describes physical layouts or movements.
The source gave a really specific example of this that I loved. It was something about a number being rotated.
Right. The sentence was something like, the number 8 when rotated 90 degrees looks like a pair of spectacles.
Now, to understand that, you can't just use a dictionary definition of 8 or spectacles.
No. When you read that, your brain isn't just processing the abstract concept of the number 8. The spatial imagery network lights up to physically visualize that rotation. You're mentally grabbing the number and turning it on its side.
So even though I'm reading text, my brain is acting like I'm looking at a physical object.
You are building a spatial model. The text isn't just data, it's a blueprint for a visual simulation. This network is what allows you to track where the killer is standing in the room relative to the victim.
Or how a character navigates a maze.
Exactly. If you disrupt this area of the brain, people can still read the words, but they lose the ability to build that mental map.
Which brings us to network number 4. And I think this is the most profound one in the paper, the protagonist perspective network.
This is in the medial frontal cortex. Now,
Yeah.
Here is where it gets really interesting. This area is not usually considered a language area at all. It's the part of the brain involved in theory of mind.
Theory of mind being the ability to understand that other people have thoughts, secrets, and intentions different from our own.
Correct. It's our empathy engine. It's what allows us to navigate social groups. When you read a story, this network activates to interpret the character's goals, their secrets, their emotional state.
The source mentioned it lights up specifically when there is inconsistent emotional information.
Yes. If a character who is usually kind suddenly acts cruel, your medial frontal cortex jumps into action to figure out why.
Huh.
It's trying to resolve the gap between what you know about the character and what they just did. You are literally simulating their internal state to find a justification.
That explains why we can get so angry at fictional characters, or why we cry when they die. The brain is using the exact same hardware it uses to understand real people.
Exactly. Reading fiction is practice for social reality. You aren't just processing syntax, you are running a flight simulator for human interaction.
Wow.
You're testing hypotheses about why people act the way they do.
And finally, network number 5, the coarse semantic processing network. And this brings us to the big showdown, left brain versus right brain.
Or rather, the left brain and the right brain working together. That's a critical distinction in the Mason and Just paper.
Fair. The source spends a lot of time on this. The old view was that the left hemisphere was the star. It has grammar, vocabulary, literal meaning.
And the right hemisphere was just the sidekick, maybe handling intonation or something.
Yeah. But this paper argues the right hemisphere is crucial for the big picture. And it introduces two main theories on how this works. The first is the coarse coding hypothesis.
For Mark Beeman, yeah.
I really like this concept. It's about how the brain stores word meanings, right?
Yes. So imagine the left hemisphere uses a spotlight. It lights up a word and sees the precise dictionary definition. It's fine semantic coding. It's fast, sharp, and narrow.
So I say the word foot. The left brain thinks body part at the end of the leg. Done.
Exactly. But the right hemisphere uses a lantern. It uses coarse semantic coding. It lights up a huge dim area around the word. It activates broad, distant associations.
So for foot, the right brain might vaguely activate shoe, walk, kick, soccer, maybe even inch.
Precisely. And the source mentions priming studies that prove this. The right hemisphere holds onto these distant associates, like the word deer, priming the word pony, much longer than the left hemisphere does.
And why does that matter for reading? Why do I need to think about pony when I read deer?
Because you need those distant connections to understand jokes, metaphors, or complex themes. If you only had the left hemisphere, you'd be incredibly literal. You wouldn't get the punchline.
Because the punchline relies on a connection that isn't in the dictionary definition.
Exactly. You need that broad lantern light to see the connection between two seemingly unrelated things.
So that makes sense. It's the difference between a computer reading text and a human understanding nuance. But there's a second theory about the right hemisphere too, the spillover effect.
This is a bit more mechanical. The idea here is that the left hemisphere is efficient, but it has a limited tank of gas-limited working memory.
The bucket gets full.
Right. When the text gets too hard or the syntax is really naughty, the left hemisphere's bucket overflows. The processing spills over into the right hemisphere.
So the right hemisphere is like the backup generator.
In this theory, yes. But the source suggests it's likely a combination of both. The right hemisphere handles the broad, messy connections, and it steps in when the left hemisphere is overwhelmed. It's a dynamic resource management system.
I want to see this in action. The source discusses a really cool experiment regarding inference. This is the Joey example.
Yes. The causal relatedness study. This illustrates perfectly how the brain works to fill in the blanks.
So, just to set the stage, inference is basically the reader doing the work that the writer didn't do. The writer doesn't say A caused B, so you have to figure it out.
Right. In the study, they presented participants with two sentences. The second sentence was always the outcome. The next day, his body was covered in bruises.
Okay. Gruesome, but clear. Next day, body covered in bruises.
Yeah.
Now, they changed the first sentence to see how the brain reacted.
Scenario 1 was highly related. The first sentence was, Joey's big brother punched him again and again.
Okay. Brother punches Joey, leads to the danger. Joey has bruises. That's obvious.
It's too obvious. The brain barely has to work. The inference is automatic. The left hemisphere handles it easily.
Then there was scenario 3, the distantly related one. Joey went to a neighbor's house to play, followed by, next day his body was covered in bruises.
There's a huge gap. I mean, did he fall? Was the neighbor violent? Did they play rugby? It's too vague. The brain often just gives up on making a specific causal connection.
Because there isn't enough data.
Right. The activation levels actually drop because the brain decides it's not worth the energy to solve.
But then, scenario 2, the moderately related one. Joey's crazy mother became furiously angry, followed by, next day, his body was covered in bruises.
This is the sweet spot. Notice it doesn't say she hit him, but crazy mother plus angry implies violence. The brain has to build a bridge. It has to infer. She must have physically attacked him.
And what happens in the brain during this moderate scenario?
You get the Goldilocks effect. The brain actually works hardest here. You see the highest activation in the right hemisphere integration areas. Because the link isn't given, the brain has to reach out into those coarse, distant associations.
Connecting anger to violence to bruises.
To build the story. Exactly.
It's fascinating that the brain works harder on the moderate connection than the hard one.
Well, if the connection is too hard, the brain conserves energy and stops trying. But if it's moderate, the brain knows it can solve it, so it recruits the resources to do so.
And the study found that people actually remembered this sentence better than the others, right?
Yes, because you worked for it. The cognitive effort of building that bridge cemented the memory. This is the generation effect. You remember what you generate yourself better than what is simply told to you.
That is such a cool insight for storytelling. If you spell everything out, the reader gets bored. If you make it too random, they get confused.
Yeah.
But if you give them the dots and make them draw the line,
They engage, exactly. You are forcing their right hemisphere to come online and participate. You are making them a co-author of the narrative.
Speaking of making the brain participate,
Right.
we have to talk about metaphors. Because the source makes this really critical distinction between frozen metaphors and novel metaphors.
This is one of my favorite parts of the deep dive. We tend to think all metaphors are the same, poetic language, but the brain treats them completely differently.
So a frozen metaphor is a cliche, right? Something like sharp as a razor.
Correct. You've heard it a million times. When you read sharp as a razor, your brain doesn't actually visualize a razor. It doesn't think about cutting or steel.
It just knows it means smart or quick-witted.
Exactly. The source shows that the brain treats these almost like literal words. It uses the left hemisphere language areas. It's essentially just vocabulary retrieval.
So cliches are neurologically boring.
They are efficient, but yes, boring. They don't require simulation. But then you have novel metaphors. The source uses a great example. The investors were squirrels collecting nuts, or the one about the parachute, were surrounded by great white mushrooms.
Great white mushrooms.
Mm.
Now that is new. You don't have a dictionary definition for investors equals squirrels. So the left hemisphere checks its database, finds nothing.
And calls for help. And who answers the call? The right hemisphere and the spatial imagery network. To understand great white mushrooms referring to parachutes, you have to mentally see the shape. You have to run a simulation.
So reading a poetic, creative metaphor is a visual and spatial workout, whereas reading a cliche is just filing paperwork.
In a manner of speaking, yes. The novel metaphor requires the construction of a blended space, taking the properties of a mushroom and the properties of a parachute and smashing them together to create a new meaning.
This brings us back to that idea of the protagonist-interpreter network, too. Did the source say that sometimes metaphors light up that medial frontal area, the empathy center?
Yes, specifically if the metaphor is describing a person. If I say, my boss is a rock, I'm describing his internal character. The brain uses the theory of mind network to understand what rock implies about his personality.
Is he stubborn? Is he reliable?
Is he emotionless? Yeah. It's amazing how dynamic this is.
We started this conversation saying reading feels simple, but we've just described a process that involves visual construction, emotional simulation, coherence checking.
And checking distant memory associations. It really is a dynamic recruitment. That's the key phrase from the text. The brain recruits whatever networks it needs based on what the text throws at it.
So if the text is simple, the left hemisphere handles it.
Right. If the text has spatial descriptions, the parietal lobes kick in. If it has ambiguity, the right hemisphere helps out. It's not just reading, it's simulating.
And that has profound implications. It confirms that the breakdown between language and thought is, well, it's artificial. Understanding a story is thinking.
It involves the same systems we use to navigate the physical and social world.
So when I'm reading a novel, I'm not just processing syntax. I'm running a flight simulator for social life.
You are, and the protagonist-interpreter network proves that. You are exercising your empathy. You are practicing being human.
I want to leave our listeners with a thought that struck me while reading about the right hemisphere's role.
The distant associates concept.
Exactly. We established that the right hemisphere is what allows for deep insight, creativity, and understanding complex metaphors because it keeps those faint, distant connections alive.
It allows the slow cooking of ideas and lets you connect dots that are far apart.
Right. But we live in a world that is increasingly built for the left hemisphere. Short, literal, punchy information. Headlines, tweets, quick summaries.
Highly efficient, low ambiguity, instant gratification.
Exactly. If we start reading long-form, complex narratives that require us to bridge gaps and visualize novel metaphors, are we starving our right hemisphere?
That is a provocative question. If we don't exercise that coarse coding network, the ability to hold two distant ideas together until they click, we might be losing more than just reading comprehension. We might be losing a specific type of creativity.
A type of insight, maybe?
Yes, the kind that only comes from that broad, messy, parallel processing.
A little something to chew on the next time you decide to scroll instead of picking up that novel.
Indeed. It might be time to give the lantern a little more fuel.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the neural networks of narrative.
It was a pleasure.
Keep those networks firing, and we'll see you next time.